In order to do this project, I read a research paper, understood it, and now I'm going to teach you in the most simplified way possible. So the topic of the research is the construction of human rib cage based on the X-ray chest images. It is written by Christopher Koehler, Thomas Vishigal, and Fozu Golshani. Now let's know a bit about the X-rays in order to get a better glance of the research paper. So when the X-rays are sent from the front and there is a board at the back collecting the X-rays, it is known as the anterior posterior X-ray image, also referred as AP. But when the X-rays are sent from the back to the front and there is a board in the front collecting the X-rays, it is known as posterior and anterior X-ray images. It is better to go for the posterior anterior X-ray images as it gives us the image of the heart and it gives a more truer and accurate size of the body organs. For example, when the shadow of the hand is casted on the wall and we move further away from the wall, the bigger the size of the shadow gets. And the same happens with the posterior anterior X-ray images, because in case of posterior anterior images, the film is located in the front and it is closer to the we can say closer to the any organ that is present, especially the heart. So the closer it is to the film, the truer and accurate, or we can say the more focused the size is going to be, which is helpful while diagnosing a disease or checking of a patient's health. X-rays are very two-dimensional in nature because it only gives a length or the width of the lungs. But when it comes to the lateral films, that is also known as lateral X-ray images, that is produced or when the X-rays are sent off from either left or right and they are collected on the opposite sides by the board. In that case, we can there in the picture even see the diagram, or we can see the heart or even the other organs in a more truer way, in a more focused way, giving a very three-dimensional view. Therefore, lateral views are considered to be three-dimensional in nature. So the horizontal ribs that are present is also known as the posterior part of the ribs, but the ribs that are coming down that are in the front but are coming down in nature is known as the anterior sections of the ribs. Two-dimensional chest radiographs are most common for diagnosing pulmonary diseases. These are widely used due to the fact that they are inexpensive and they expose the patients to the less CT radiations in comparison to the 3D CT scans. However, these are very limited in nature as they only give the 2D view of the patient's data. Since the X-rays is just a projection of the human or the patient's body, it is difficult to visualize from the 3D dimensional standpoint the configurations of bones and the other organs. From a visualization standpoint, it becomes necessary to have a 3D reconstruction of ribs in order to complement the X-rays, which help us to provide a frame of reference to diagnose where a disease is located and how far it has spread. This paper introduces a knowledge-based algorithm to generate approximate 3D reconstruction of a human rib cage by combining geometric knowledge about true rib cages with an interactive human rib cage segmentation technique. Measurements taken from these X-rays are combined with the knowledge about the general shapes of the individual ribs in order to create a 3D geometric template for each rib, so that it will require the minimal amount of data from the X-ray images to transform them into the subject's true ribs. Here, the very point is to be noted that the first rib, 11th rib and the 12th rib is not taken in order to reduce the complexity, because we all know that first rib is located at the topmost, which makes the stuff and the algorithm very complex, and in case of 11th and 12th rib it becomes extremely difficult due to the presence that the last two ribs are combined with a one rib. Therefore, these ribs are not taken while studying. Moreover, only the left side of the rib cage is first studied, and then the same algorithm is applied on the right side. And the reason is that in the left side part of the body, the heart is present and it becomes more complex. Therefore, first the complexity of this rib part of the rib cage is solved, as it is very easy to apply the algorithm on the right part. Early attempts to segment the ribs in the X-ray, images have involved fitting parabolas to the ribs. Vertical derivative sections through the lung fields have also been used to extract the points on the edges of the ribs. Sinusoidal functions, also referred as sine functions, have been used to fit to vertical sections of X-ray images to detect ribs. Arsenics have also been used to get a more precise segmentation of rib borders after finding out initial approximations with the modified borders of Hug transform. Another approach has been used, that is to fit the statistical model of a rib cage to a patient specific data in order to segment the rib borders. Segmentation of scoliotic rib borders have also been achieved with semi-automated technique using directional filters and edge following. Due to the fact that it is the only published algorithm capable of segmenting the anterior ribs in the PA X-ray image, the technique described will be used while testing the 3D construction algorithm. One of the past method even involves pixel based iterative classification that is used to segment the posterior ribs. Here the scoliotic ribs referred to the bones that is present in the spine. There is currently no reliable way to automatically segment the individual ribs or even the outer border of the rib cage in a lateral X-ray images, due to the fact that there is a lot of noise in the lateral X-ray images, and the ribs of both the sides of the body are superimposed on each other. For this reason, an interactive approach was used to identify the outer border of the rib cage in the lateral X-ray images. A technician identifies the front and the back of each rib. Now, a B-spline curve is formed. Is fit to the selected points in order to form the approximate boundary around the outside of the rib cage. Histogram equalizations is used in a local window surrounding the technician's mouse cursor in order to clarify the image features in area where intensity change is set. Here, histogram equalization is one of the methods where ultimate data is actually rounded off to the nearest integer, and the B-spline curve is a local control point where the degree of the polynomial doesn't depend upon the number of control points, but it actually depends upon the order of the polynomial. To speak in very general sense, when we see an X-ray, then the black part that is represented in the X-ray actually represents the trapped air, and the white part is actually the bones, the super white part, and the gray part, the grayish part are the organs that are represented there. So in case of here, when there is a different light change and there we cannot see the actual figure because computers can't see the small changes in the colors in the X-rays. Therefore, to do that, we have to change the intensity of the color so that the difference of the black color and the gray, the white is clearly visible and identified by the computer. Now, the second step is locating anchor points. The segmentation step identifies the outline of each rib. However, the further classification of these edges is needed before inputting them into a rib template deformation algorithm. In particular, the vertical lines corresponding to the maximum and the minimum coordinates of the lateral rib are marked, as well as the minimum x coordinates of the posterior and the anterior ribs. Also, the top and the bottom of the edges and the anterior portions of the ribs are marked with different intensities, as we can see in the figure. Now, several quantities which will be used to generate each rib template are also defined. Here, the sectional radius, represented as SR, is defined as the half the difference between the lateral maximum and the lateral minimum x coordinates. So, x coordinate is typically the point which comes into the posterior part. Now, the rib radius, defined as capital R, is the rib width minus the sectional radius. The rib width, represented as W, is defined as the difference between the lateral maximum and the posterior minimum x coordinates. The third step is 3D template generation. Since the approximation of the shape of a single civil room is known, a 3D half torus mesh can be generated of each rib as a starting point. The radius and the sectional radius of each newly generated rib template are taken to be R and SR values measured from the corresponding segmented rib. In order to ensure that enough resolution in the rib template is taken, there must be one or more axial subdivisions for every pixel in x direction of the corresponding segmented rib. So here the segmented rib is actually the representation of the first rib. So for example, the first rib for the left is the first rib for the right, and so on. So this is the same segmentation, like they represent each other in the cross directions. A rib template with only 50 axial subdivisions is used for the remainder of the images. Here we can see in the image of the initial rib template. However, to ensure that the resolution is high enough in practice, the number of axial subdivisions that is represented as Q in each rib template is defined as follows. It's the difference of the pi by sine inverse into 1 by sectional radius minus 1. Starting with a shape that is similar to a true 3D rib helps to the fact that there is not enough data in the X-ray images alone to know that their original 3D shapes would have been. Linearly transforming the template as a whole would not give enough flexibility to align the segmented rib edges. So it still needs to be broken into separate vertex clusters which can be individually aligned to the segmented ribs. Vertex clustering. Before performing any transformations, the vertices in the rib templates meshes have to be classified in a similar way that the edges in the segmentation output were classified. The vertices are divided into clusters and subclusters on the portions of the rib template that need to be deformed simultaneously. The algorithm starts by defining several groups of vertex subclusters, which will be later classified as belonging to the anterior, then the lateral, and the posterior portion of the rib. The vertex subclusters are created by defining the point between the two ends of the half torus as a pole in the polar coordinate system and grouping all the vertices that have the same angle theta into a subcluster. So if this is a whole rib, then the part that is visible in the front is the posterior, the part that is in the side is the lateral, and the part that is at the end is the anterior part of the rib. And this is a half torus that has these two poles. Once the subclusters have been formed, they are classified. To do this, the entire rib template is rotated approximately the same angle that a rib would be rotated. Since it is unreliable to automatically segment the rib edges in lateral X-ray images, to determine the true rotation amount, an experiment was performed to determine a default rotational angle. A manual segmentation was done on 80 of the most distinguished rib edges from 5 randomly selected lateral X-ray images. A least square regression line was fed onto each of the segmented edges and its angle was measured. The angle average of these least squares regression line was found to be 24.8 degree. For this reason, a rotation of 24.8 degree is applied to each rib template. It is important that a template be rotated to a fairly accurate starting angle in order to classify the subclusters into the lateral, posterior and anterior vertex clusters and to reduce the distortions in the final output. Properly classifying the subclusters assures that they will be aligned to the correct segmented edge. To classify the subclusters, an algorithm starts by finding the vertices in each subcluster with the maximum and the minimum y coordinate values. The subclusters whose maximum and the minimum y coordinates are not within the experimentally determined threshold value of the border of the 3D model when it is projected onto the xy plane are assigned to the lateral vertex cluster. The remaining subclusters are assigned to the posterior and the anterior vertex clusters based on whether the y coordinate values are below or above the maximum y coordinate value of the entire lateral vertex cluster. Figure 5 shows the proper diagram of this. Here, the anterior part is marked in the red color, the lateral part is marked with green, and the posterior part is marked with the blue, forming the different subclusters groups. This is one of the example of a simple template, but it works in the same way with a more detailed rib template. Once the vertex clustering is complete, it is possible to transform the vertex clusters so that they will line up in the segmentation data that was taken from the original X-ray images. Since our templates are shaped approximately like the real ribs and their thickness was measured from the rib segmentation, it is sufficient to only align them the segmented ribs in the PA X-ray image, then to take the scale to fit the rib cage borders in the lateral X-ray image. In our example, the segmented edge data from the PA X-ray image is placed on the XY plane at the bottom right corner, and the segmented lateral X image is placed on the YZ plane with the bottom left corner. Due to the fact that it simplifies the methodology, if the vertex clusters are always scaled up, the algorithm starts by translating the entire template down so that the projection of its vertex with maximum Y value is below the pixel on the corresponding segmented rib with the minimum Y value. Also, before starting to transform the templates, the vertex subcluster should be removed from the end of the anterior vertex until the ratio of the distance between the lateral minimum and the posterior minimum anchor points and the lateral minimum and the anterior minimum anchor points is as close as possible to the ratio of distances between the minimum and the maximum x coordinates of the posterior and the anterior vertex clusters. After the template has been aligned with the x-axis, the clusters of the vertices are aligned by one along the y-axis. This step final gives the 3D model a near perfect alignment with the segmented ribs in the PA X-ray image. Each subcluster in the posterior cluster is scaled and transformed so that the vertices in the maximum and the minimum y coordinate values are aligned with the y coordinate values of the segmented edges corresponding to the top and the posterior rib. The anterior subclusters are transformed in a similar way. Due to the fact that the maximum and the minimum vertices of the subclusters in the lateral cluster do not necessarily lie in the border of the 3D model, when it is projected onto the XY plane, the entire lateral group is translated along the y-axis all at once so that it lines up with the lateral maximum anchor points. This process is shown in the figure. At this point, the 3D template is completely aligned with the segmentation data from the PA X-ray image. We have not altered the template along the Z dimension, so to finish the transformation process, the entire rib template is scaled and translated along the Z axis so that the vertices with the minimum and the maximum Z coordinate values are aligned with the anterior and the posterior borders of the rib cage in the lateral X-ray image. The lateral cluster is then rotated around the Z axis so that the angle matches the angle between the two vertices of the template with the maximum and the minimum Z coordinate. This is the last set of transformation as shown in the figure. The goal of the presented methodology is to get a good 3D approximation whose projection aligns with the segmented ribs in the PA X-ray image. To use a 3D scanner output is not available. In order to quantitatively measure the accuracy of the reconstruction compared to the original segmentation, the reconstructed mesh is then converted to a volume and then rendered with a maximum intensity projection. The resulting projection of the reconstruction is then compared with the original segmented ribs on a pixel by pixel basis. Here, the figure shows the differences between the original segmentation of X-ray image and the projected shell-youth of the 3D construction. Pixels that were projected in the shell-youth but not in the segmentation are marked in white, and they account for 6.973% of the total shell-youth. And the pixels that were in segmentation but not in the shell-youth are marked in black and account for 0.537% of the total segmentation in this case. As this can be seen in the image, mostly single pixels on the boundary of the rib are detected as different, which is due to the partial pixel effect within the boundary X-ray images and rounding during the vocalization process. Here, overall, this comparison testifies to the good match between the reconstructed rib cage and the X-ray image. Pixels are actually 2D in nature, whereas the voxels are 3D in nature. So when we see pixels, we see it as a square, area covered in a square. But when we look for voxels, it is the volume covered in a cube. One of the major uses of the 3D reconstruction software is the visualization tool. It is much easier for the brain to comprehend the real shape of a person's rib cage by seeing it rotating in a 3D instead of looking at 2D X-ray images. The 3D construction software can also be combined with computer-aided diagnosis software in applications like early detection of lung cancer to generate 3D size estimates and improve visualization of affected regions. For example, the CAD software is capable of segmenting several potentially affected areas in PA and lateral X-ray images. The algorithms could determine where the segmented regions from both the X-ray images intersect and show a 3D estimate of the size of the affected region framed by the ribs. Sharing my experience while doing the project, I would say it was not difficult, not a little difficult, a little more difficult, but it was extremely difficult for me because if as an example, if there were 100 new terms in this research paper, then I was unaware of the 85 key terms, and it was very difficult to understand and interpret stuffs. But since actually I'm completely unaware of the computer-aided software techniques or graphic techniques and even the medical many terms, because I have to actually learn to read read X-ray image and how does it take place. I have to go get the meaning of each of these words that are used here, and then though I got a good visualization of the research paper, but still I would say that those 15 terms that I didn't understand form the major concept of the research paper, and I feel bad at that. I even wanted for once to take the help of medical interns who are aware of these terms, but I just wanted to give things a try, that whether I can do it or not. And I feel happy, though it isn't good at a good level that I explained the research paper, but still I got in my inner self how this whole research was conducted. Though I know that I'm when it comes to expression of my expression, that how I explained, it wasn't good enough. So for TKS, I would say TKS is all about learning, and that's what inspires mostly, because the reason I'm very much interested in TKS is the way it functions, the way it practices and makes students learn, challenges them, and it was a great journey to prepare this project.